Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast. I'm Steve, your host. Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy, which is an Agora Podcast Network member. We are, of course, on Facebook and Twitter, which you can find the links to Facebook and Twitter, along with the email address, subscribe, iTunes, and all of that. You can find that at my website, a2zhistorypage.com. Today we have episode 78, which is titled Gregory the Great, Background and Biography. I recorded this episode with Ben Jacobs of the Wittenberg to Westphalia podcast as a collaboration because Gregory the Great is a major force in both of our podcasts. As the title of this episode suggests, today we will talk about and get into the biography and the context in which Gregory lived, which is just very fascinating in its own right. Then in the next episode, Ben and I will talk about some of the interpretation of Gregory and his actions as Pope and how they influenced history, not only the history of his times, but long into the future. Before we go, though, and get into that episode, I thought I'd quickly mention the Agora Podcast Network shops. You can find those shops. The URL is a little tricky right now, but we're working on that. The URL is agora-podcast-network-shop.shopify.com. And that is the place where you can find all sorts of t-shirts, coffee mugs, and other memorabilia from many of your favorite Agora Podcast Network shows. I'm in the process of setting up a shop. If you're really, really super interested in History of the Papacy mugs or something like that, let me know, and that will help me to light a fire under me to get the shop up and going. Right now, it's kind of keeps getting pushed further back on the back burner. But if there is something you're particularly interested in, I have some logos and designs and that sort of thing that would go on cups and t-shirts, but I just haven't gotten to setting up the store. But your feedback would definitely, if that's something you're interested in, I will go full steam ahead and get the store set up. The URL for the Agora Shops in the show notes as well, because that one's a kind of a hard one to follow in audio format. I really, really sincerely appreciate you taking the time to listen. Don't forget to send in your ratings and reviews on iTunes. I really love to hear your feedback, and it helps to get the History of the Papacy noticed more on Apple Podcasts. I look forward to seeing you on our next stop on our trip through the history of the popes of Rome. And now on to our discussion about Gregory the Great with Ben Jacobs. I hope you enjoy.
Since, then, we have shown what manner of man the pastor ought to be, let us now set forth after what manner he should teach. For, as long before us, Gregory Nazianzen, of reverend memory, has taught, one and the same exhortation does not suit all, inasmuch as all are not bound together by similarity of character. For the things that profit some often hurt others, seeing that also, for the most part, herbs which nourish some animals are fatal to others. And the gentle hissing that quiets horses incites whelps. And the medicine which abates one disease aggravates another. And the food which invigorates the life of the strong kills little children. Therefore, according to the quality of the hearers, ought the discourse of teachers to be fashioned, so as to suit all and each for their several needs, and yet never deviate from the art of common edification. For what are the intent minds of hearers but, so to speak, a kind of harp, which the skillful player, in order to produce a tune possessing harmony, strikes in various ways? And for this reason the strings render back a melodious sound, because they are struck indeed with one quill, but not with one kind of stroke. Whence every teacher also, that he may edify all in the one virtue of charity, ought to touch the hearts of his hearers out of one doctrine, but not with one and the same exhortation. Quote from the Book of Pastoral Rule by Pope Gregory I.
Quote read by James Early from the Presidential Fight Club podcast and the American History Fanatics Facebook page. Check them out. Greetings, my name is Benjamin Jacobs, and this is episode 44, A Tale of Two Gregories, Part 1. Gregory the Great with Steve Guerra of the History of the Papacy podcast. We are approaching a milestone in our discussion of the Middle Ages. The years between 1000 and 1300 set in motion massive changes in European society that would have a major impact on the early modern period, aka the point of this show. Many historians now argue that the modern period actually began in 1300. The reforms of the papacy, starting with Gregory VII, that I referenced last episode, were pivotal to that change, but they did not come out of nowhere. Now, I think I've done a decent job in the last two episodes in sort of setting the stage in terms of the organized shape of the church, and in the many episodes before that of setting the stage for Europe in general, but I've left out a lot of the nitty-gritty details of the specific actions taken by the popes as individuals. For the most part, this was a choice made in the interest of time, because there are other better podcasts that will be covering these topics. For example, the History of the Papacy with Steve Guerra. I also made this choice because most of the popes in our timeline have been fairly generic. And I'm also sort of a person with a bias towards social history rather than focusing on the actions of great men, you may have noticed. But in doing things this way, I have to admit a mea culpa, and I skipped over Gregory the Great, aka Gregory the First. I thought I could get away with it. He didn't seem all that pertinent to the early modern period, but all my sources talk about him in length, and so here we are. I clearly screwed up in skipping him. I didn't want to do it, but I have to. Given my reluctance and unfamiliarity, I thought it would be useful to bring in an outside expert to help us get through this. And so we are joined today by Steve Guerra, the creator and talent behind the excellent History of the Papacy podcast, a fellow member of the Agora podcast network, a friend of the show, and a fan of fine craft beers. Steve, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on. That's, I love talking about Gregory, so this is awesome.
It's of course wonderful to have you. Now, as we start up on this discussion of Gregory the Great, I should help position us a little bit in who we are talking about. I referenced a Pope Gregory in the last episode. As I said before, that is Gregory VII. There have actually been 16 Catholic popes named Gregory and 2 anti-popes. This one that we're going to be talking about today is Pope Gregory I. Gregory is a towering figure in the history of Catholicism in Europe. His papacy began in 590, and he's one of only 2 popes to be called the Great. I think one of the big things that we're going to be talking about today is how we feel about that. But let's start by getting through some background and some biographical materials. Gregory was born roughly 540, we'll talk about that, but in the background of the migration period, the rough part of European history, the early Middle Ages, when the empire was falling apart, and in particular, in the context of the Italian wars and the plagues of Justinian. Steve, do you want to give us a little bit of background about the context that Gregory came into?
So Gregory was born, like you said, in about 540. They don't have a record for that, which is interesting. But that's right around the end. I'm not as familiar with the Italian wars, but that's kind of in the middle-ish of the Byzantine period where they were attacking in the wars of Justinian. That was a really interesting time because a lot of scholars say that really was the end of the Western Roman Empire, not as much 476. Things pretty much carried over the institutions of the Roman Empire under the Goths, but maybe not all of the pomp and circumstance of an emperor, but the socially speaking and governmentally speaking. But when Justinian came in and conquered Italy, that's when the floor really fell out from the Western Roman Empire, especially in Italy. Like you said, there was the plague of Justinian where a lot of people died. There was a climate change where a lot of people died. There was crop failures where a lot of people died. And for me, I know a lot of people don't like the term Dark Ages, but I'd have to say, like, if you were an Italian who was born in the early 500s and was lucky enough to live into the mid 500s, it was probably looked pretty dark to you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've certainly tried to avoid that term in my show, but I agree that, in terms of the lack of written material and the archaeological evidence of like people living in these hollowed out cities, it seems as much like an apocalypse as anything we can conceive of.
Yeah, like a bad post-apocalyptic novel when you're looking at Rome that had maybe 100,000 people or less, but then it's down to 10, 30,000 people within a few decades.
Yeah. People farming, people grazing cattle on the farm and stuff like that. And that's, attested in the archaeology, not just the written sources. Yeah, Justinian pretty much was still working in that old Roman Empire fashion of making a desert and calling it peace, except that he didn't get the chance to like rebuild things afterwards and make a new Pax Romana because, unbeknownst to him and his generals, his conquest of Italy was immediately followed by the plague of Justinian and then the Persian Wars and eventually the rise of Islam. And ultimately that was sort of the high point of the reassertion of the Byzantine Empire. And it really left Italy an absolute mess. He sent in too small a force. They didn't have enough to just conquer everything outright. So it became a series of running battles, lots of sieges, which are always super destructive. And then, of course, the plague and the climate change was probably more of a long-term thing. We discussed in my episodes on Italy, the deforestation of central and southern Italy, creating real problems. So anyway, I think that's enough on the background of Italy in general. What was the place of the papacy within all this? How coherent was the church at this point?
I put in a lot of notes here, so you can shut me down whenever you want. But I think it's kind of interesting that these were the power of the papacy. You have to completely forget everything you know about the papacy because it really didn't exist at this point. The Pope was titularly the head of the Western Church. The Patriarchate of Rome had the largest area geographically. Now, I use that term patriarchate. There was 5 patriarchates or like head bishops in Christendom at that time. There was Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. You can kind of throw in there, but that was more of a bonus prize that they gave to Jerusalem. The real powerful ones were Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch. And Rome had the largest geographical territory. It was everything in Western Europe, the Balkans and Greece, along with the western section of North Africa, like basically everything east or west, rather, of modern day Libya. So that's a huge territory, and it was a fairly diverse territory, probably less diverse than you would imagine it today, but still very diverse. Well, less diverse than today, but still fairly diverse.
What kind of actual control did Rome actually have over, it was basically the only patriarchate of the entire Latin West. How much control did they have?
You have to political power, basically none. They had some influence, but politically almost none. Theologically, in theory, they had control over these areas, but from each area geographically, it was more or less. The Pope was pretty powerful in central Italy, Sicily, and southern Italy. But if you take a look at a place like northern Africa, there was a splinter group called the Donatists that had started in during the time of Diocletian in the 300s, late 200s, early 300s, that was still powerful and growing more powerful. And they were a splinter group where the Pope had very little control over them. You had just to the east of the Italian peninsula in Greece and the Balkans, where they used their position in between Constantinople and Rome to basically do whatever they wanted to. And culturally, they were more connected to Constantinople. So anything that the Pope said that they didn't like, they would just ignore and look to Constantinople. So that was a constant clash. An interesting one that'll come up as we talk more is in Britain. And Britain, traditionally, people think, well, that's after the Anglo-Saxons came, it was pagan, but more modern archaeology and genetic studies shows that a lot of the Celtic population was still there. And there was probably a lot more Christianity there. It just wasn't very well organized.
Yeah.
And then the urban areas of Gaul and modern day France, especially in southern France, like Arles, they were trying to exert independence over the papacy. And the papacy, over the course of the few decades prior to Gregory, would have more or less success of trying to rein them in. Certain sees wanted to be more independent or less, and that was a constant struggle for the papacy.
Yeah, I know there was always one city or another that was trying to get the Frankish emperors to make them patriarchs to raise them to the patriarchate. And it was always like just one early death away from happening.
Then you have Spain, which was officially run by Arians, but it did have a significant Catholic population as well. So you had Arians actually in North Africa and in Spain, which makes things very interesting because that's another, at least the Donatists, they were mostly on the same page as the Catholics, where the Arians were on an entirely different page.
Right.
So you have that as well, where the popes had zero control over them or influence over them. During Gregory's reign, the king of the Visigoths in Spain did convert to Catholicism, which then, that became more popular amongst the ruling nobility. Gregory didn't have a whole lot to do. I think that was forces that were well on the way before Gregory hit the scene that they were going to become Catholic.
Yeah, sure.
But so, I mean, it was really splintered, that whole patriarchate.
I mean, it's not like the Pope had any control over the selection of bishops or anything. Those were all elected, basically, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that's a good background to just get us started. What do we know about Gregory's early life?
He was from a senatorial family, a wealthy family, but that was also really steeped in Christianity. He had 2 or 3 aunts who were already nuns, 2 papal ancestors, Pope Felix III in the late 400s, and then this name is so hard, Agapetus, who was not a direct relative. I think he was, but and his papacy was a few decades before, but he was in that family. So it's
right.
And that was pretty common at the times. The aristocracy was growing into the church at this time.
Right. It was the only way to exert it was the only form of political organization that Italy really had at that point. So,
and Gregory received the best education possible in Rome, but that education might not have been to the quality that was possible just a few decades previous to that.
Yeah.
And a lot of scholars even question what level of proficiency Gregory had in Greek. He probably spoke it. And given what some of the things he did in his later life, it's kind of hard to believe that he didn't at least speak Greek. But his knowledge of academic and high arts Greek was probably not where it would have been earlier in the 6th century.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know from my reading that there were like a bunch of Greek monasteries scattered around Rome, which is something that I've always been fascinated by and haven't had the opportunity to go down that rabbit hole in my own research. But yeah, it does make sense that, you know, actually getting an education in Greek wouldn't necessarily have been super possible given the time period. But speaking of monasteries, how did Gregory enter the church?
He became a monk, and that's what his true love was. You see that in every source. That's all he really wanted to be, was a monastic. Mm-hmm. But he started several monasteries throughout Italy, and that sort of foreshadows his ability as an organizer. After that, he was called up because he was educated and he was from the right family. His father held a secular post in the Roman government, and I think he was a senator or something for what the Senate was worth at that time.
Sure.
But that made Gregory a prime candidate to be a papal representative. Nowadays, they call them nuncios. They had a Greek name for that back then, but it's basically it's a ambassador of the Pope to the emperor in Constantinople.
Right. Just to double back to the monasticism, I read briefly that he had actually turned, like after his father died, he turned his father's estate into a monastery, which is, I thought that was an interesting story.
Yeah, their mansion on the Caelian Hill in Rome, he turned into a monastery, St. Andrew's, I believe it was called.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I just thought that was interesting. So, papal politics at this time is fascinating, and I've been fighting to avoid running down that rabbit hole with the show and doing another Gadeshi kind of series. But so how did Gregory become Pope? Because it's odd that someone who's so free from scandal essentially ended up becoming Pope at that time.
The story, at least, is that everybody came together and saw that he was in Constantinople. We should probably say that from 579 to 586. And he had a hit or miss relationship he got along well with the emperor, but he clashed with the patriarch of Constantinople, who was starting at that time to be called the ecumenical patriarch, which meant like worldwide patriarch.
Okay, yeah.
And that was a sticking point. It sounds like a silly sticking point, but there was a whole history of Constantinople. Constantinople wasn't a patriarchate until Constantine made Constantinople a patriarchate.
Right.
And then slowly Constantinople went from, it wasn't a patriarchate, it became a patriarchate. Then they said, oh, it's only second to Rome. And then another council made it, well, it's not quite second to Rome. It's like Rome's little brother, but Rome's better little brother. And the popes were never okay with that.
Right. And to be fair, that's not pure ego. There was a certain amount of sort of the way that these things were supposed to be justified was you're supposed to have an apostle that founded your city, and Rome had two.
Yeah.
And who knew what Byzantium was at the time that the apostles were around? But anyway.
And another little factoid that I thought was interesting, and you get a better view of Constantinople's and the Patriarch of Constantinople's perspective, is that the title ecumenical was added to all of the emperor's main advisors. And it was sort of just to say, like, the Eastern Roman Empire is the center of the world, and the ecumenical garbage collector was like the garbage collector. So it's kind of you can see why somebody would take it the wrong way, but you could also see, well, maybe they're just making a mountain out of a molehill with that title.
Right. Yeah.
Gregory is acclaimed and elected pope, but he was still just a junior deacon. He wasn't even a priest at that point, which wasn't entirely unusual. It was unusual in the fact that Gregory was young to be elected pope and relatively green.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed, and this is sort of this is a total aside, it's an interesting parallel with Venetian politics. When things got really contentious in Rome, they would always go for these like septuagenarians or octogenarians, which in the Middle Ages, that was just like punting because, they're only going to live for a year or two. But that was like a feature of the Venetian system. It's like, we always pick someone who's over 60 because no matter how bad they are, we know they're going to die in a couple of years.
It's interesting with Gregory that at this point, he petitioned the Roman emperor, the Eastern Roman Emperor Maurice, to not for Maurice to not accept his election as papacy. So at that point, the Byzantine emperor had to stamp, at least officially, that he was allowing someone to become the papacy, which I think standing in modern times, looking back, you'd be like, why would the Eastern Roman Emperor have to put a stamp on who was becoming Pope? And that fits the papacy into this bigger time period called the Byzantine papacy. Right.
Yeah, I mean, the whole Eastern Empire was much, the term Kaiseropapism comes from the Eastern Empire and the late antique period, and the way that the empire worked is there was the church and the state were completely intertwined, and the church was supposed to justify the state, and the state was supposed to protect and help organize the church. And part of that was that the emperor had some say in who got to be bishop and who got to be priests and stuff. Which is interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
That really connects to the entire history of Christianity to that point, where a bishop and a priest was not a political position, and they really had to be connected to the political authorities. That was something that they had always talked about, that there was an emperor and a bishop. It was an early form of the separation of church and state. Things are starting to change at this point because the state or the political entity is collapsing and there's nobody to fill the void.
Yeah. And I think that it goes to a lot of, just broadly speaking, a lot of the interesting contradictions in Christianity in general and Catholicism and Orthodoxy in particular date back to the moment when, this insurgent religion of crazy radicals suddenly became the official religion of the empire when Constantine converted. And they spent then centuries trying to reconcile this religion, which had a lot of baked in suspicion of authority, with the fact that now they were supposed to be propping up authority.
Yeah, that was definitely a conflict area for a long time.
So I think this actually gets us to a little bit more context about what Gregory came into when he became Pope. And we talked a bit about the Italian Wars, but to give a little bit more context, that after everything sort of went downhill with the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Wars and the plague, and then the rise of Islam in the East, the Byzantines couldn't really devote resources to Italy. And so to finish off the Ostrogoths and everything, they started using diplomacy to try and get different groups to fight each other. And one of the things they did was to get the Lombards to invade Italy. And as we've covered in my show in a little bit more depth, the Lombards kind of wiped the floor up with the Ostrogoths and then just kept going, which then left the Byzantine holdings in Italy facing this wave of Lombard invaders coming into Italy. And basically everything that wasn't super strongly fortified fell pretty quickly. which left the Byzantines with these sort of very tenuous holdings. There was sort of a 5-city area in northern Italy around Ravenna, and then Rome, and this thin strip connecting them that was basically, if you look geographically on a topographical map, it was just this valley that went between the two ridges of the Apennines. So it was walled off by mountains. And then they had a bunch of fortified cities along the coast, and sort of southern Italy hadn't fallen yet because it was just too far away. But above, north and south of this strip in central Italy, the Lombards had taken things over. And so the main thing that the papacy was facing at this point from a geopolitical standpoint was the fact that they were in the situation where they respected imperial law. They were loyal to the Byzantines, but Byzantine power was failing in the war against the Lombards. And so how does this come into play with his rule?
It's interesting in several ways. This is the point where the Pope Gregory had a lot of trouble with the Exarch of Ravenna. That was the Byzantine representative in Italy, the leader in Italy. And Gregory could not get any help from him. I don't remember his name. I don't even think it's really important. Yeah, Gregory could not get any help from him. Plus, this is where in the East, Constantinople was constantly fighting these issues with the Monophysites. That was a rival Christian theological position that was incredibly important in the East. There was the Council of Chalcedon in 451, where the Chalcedonians, they were the ones whose position was forwarded in this council. They were mostly in northern section of the Mediterranean and in the western section, where in the Middle East and in Egypt, this Monophysite position won out. And Constantinople was constantly trying to square the circle with Chalcedonianism and Monophysitism just so that they could live together and be one empire. It's one of the weaknesses of basing your imperial ideology on religion. Yeah. If some group decides that they disagree, they're willing to go to the wall for it, and all of a sudden your political empire is like, well, I mean, this isn't really the important thing. The important thing is fighting the Persians, but now all of a sudden we need to figure out how to live together. And one of the issues was that the Chalcedonians in the West, they didn't care about the Monophysites, and they certainly didn't care to make any compromise with them. And the Monophysites living in Egypt particularly had zero interest in making any compromise with the Chalcedonians. So those battle lines were drawn. And so that's what made it so difficult for the emperors in Constantinople, because they had to constantly try to compromise. And they would.
Yeah, I mean, if the emperor is going, like, I need these guys to fight the Persians. They're right on the border. And the Pope's going, border? What?
Yeah. So it was one compromise after another that the emperor would come up with. The Henoticon was one that caused a huge schism between Rome and Constantinople about 100 years previous to this. Then there's monotheletism, monoenergism. They come up with all these different, essentially, they're not even theological compromises. They're political compromises that nobody buys into.
Right. So, I mean, with all this stuff going on, that sort of creates a political tension between Gregory and the Byzantines.
Yeah, in short, that's where that gets that political controversy of the East gets injected into Italy is that the official position of the Byzantine representatives in Ravenna is this monotheletism, that the popes are like, this is crazy. We're not going to compromise with this. And that was one of Gregory's jobs pre-pope, was to try and work with the Venetians and in Ravenna to make a compromise, and that he could not get a compromise out of them. That's one of his big failures, is that he could not get a compromise, or I don't even think they were really going for compromise. They were trying to just get the Byzantines to become Chalcedonians. Yeah.
It's interesting. I read a little bit that, sort of offhand in one of my sources, that while this is going on, the Lombards are coming in and they're Arians.
Yeah.
So you've got a mostly Catholic population, you've got Arian invaders, and then in the middle of all this, a couple of the bishops in northern Italy ended up converting to either monophysitism or monotheletism, which just throws all the cards up in the air for a little while.
Plus, Arianism was so different. I haven't found any great sources about their actual practice, but their general beliefs were quite divergent from mainstream Catholicism, monophysitism or Chalcedonian. It doesn't, either of them. It was very, very different from those two.
Yeah. Which at first, I think a lot of these German invaders thought that was going to be a strength, that they wanted to keep themselves somewhat aloof from the population in general and sort of really live as a military caste with completely different practices and lifestyles and everything. A lot of them set themselves up in like camps outside of cities for long-term periods. But in the end, that created problems, being so separated from the population.
I also think when they started to marry in, and this is definitely a bird walk, but once they started marrying into the existing aristocracy, it was hard for them to maintain that separate culture when they're adopting so many different aspects of the local culture. Yeah. There just wasn't many of them.
Yeah, definitely. The result is actually pretty interesting. Italy, obviously, Italian is one of the languages that's most close to Latin, but there actually are a ton of German loanwords and a lot of German influence on the legal code that then you didn't see in places like Provence in southern France, which had more of had less influence from Germanic invaders to a certain extent. So that mixing is all fascinating.
Yeah, definitely.
So how did Gregory deal with the Lombards, since he couldn't necessarily rely on the Byzantines for help?
Well, that's the thing. All of those problems that Gregory was having with the Byzantines, and the Byzantines being either not able or not wanting to provide military support, Rome was under attack by these Lombards. He was the last man standing. There was no civil authority to take over. So that's where somebody like Gregory, he's coming in and he's organizing the militia. He's hiring generals. He is organizing defenses. He's making treaties with the Lombards. And maybe we won't call them treaties. Maybe it's just paying them off to not attack at that moment. I mean, it's much more ad hoc than treaties. Because technically he didn't have an authority to make a treaty.
Well, since he had no authority and civil society had fallen apart, forgive the obvious leading question, but so how did he pay for all this?
That's the Roman Church had enormous amounts of productive land all throughout, from the time of Constantine. The secular government, the civil government donated property to the church. When rich aristocrats would donate property to the church, I mean, even common people would donate property and assets to the church. So all throughout the Italian peninsula, into Italy, and even in North Africa, the popes owned wealthy, productive lands that they could garner resources from.
Yeah. So, and that that land was really spread out, so it was very unlikely that any one invasion would knock it all out.
But then one of the problems is that at that time it was hard to communicate, and there really wasn't an organization set up to pull all those resources together and keep them moving smoothly, which was an issue.
Yeah. So one interesting point just before we move on is it's interesting that the Roman, the political system lost its ability to compel people to pay their taxes and stuff, but people were voluntarily giving taxes essentially to the church, and so that became the new government. It's an interesting point.
We had talked about that in our episode with the warrior bishops.
Yeah.
Where oftentimes these bishops, it wasn't that they usurped power, it's that the traditional civil power is gone. Especially this happened a lot more in Northern Europe than it did in these areas, but there's nobody else there. The aristocrats moved there to their country manors and left the city, and there's nobody in the city to run the show anymore.
Yeah. So what did, apart from paying the militia and hiring generals, what else did Gregory do with all these resources that he couldn't necessarily access because they were all over the place?
One of Gregory's main things, at least that are attributed to him, is that he put what they called a rector in charge of the papal properties. And these rectors answered directly to the Pope with nobody in between, or at least technically nobody in between. Mm-hmm. So that gave the Pope a lot more central control over all of these disparate properties and supposedly helped them run more efficiently. He also, these were set up, these 7 dioceses of Rome. They're called the suburbican dioceses. Right. They became throughout time the most important papal advisors. Even to this day, they're the top advisors, and they hold the top positions in the papal curia, or central governing committee.
They were given the title of the people who were overseeing these dioceses were basically bishops, but they would come to be called cardinals, right?
Yes.
Much later.
They are the core of the College of Cardinals, these 7 bishops, and they were given the authority, or more the responsibility, to feed the poor and keep things running smoothly in their little diocese around Rome. They said it's at one point that the papal authority, the church, was feeding up to 30,000 people a day.
Oh, wow.
Now that could be an expanded number, but It was still, they were the ones who were giving alms and keeping things going.
And that won a lot of that won a lot of respect from the population, I would assume.
Oh yeah, for sure. That's obviously, if you're the person who's keeping the city relatively safe and you're feeding them, and the Byzantine emperor, whether he can do something or he can't do something, if he's not doing anything, his stock is getting lowered.
Yeah, definitely. So that sort of moved the traditional source of authority off of, the emperor delegates to the Pope, but now it's just, we just like the Pope because he's feeding us and the emperor's not really doing anything.
And I would just mention that if you're looking at that, what Gregory did was set up the medieval age of the papacy, getting the cardinal College of Cardinals going. That's a huge piece of the pie.
Yeah, definitely. So just to round the story off before we start digging in a little deeper, he eventually died, obviously. Can you just run through a little bit about his death?
Traditionally, he died in 590 from a series of illnesses, gout, everything that basically all the contemporary records and contemporary writers at the time attributed it to his extreme asceticism. And one way or the other, he was old and he was going to die.
Sure. But
he had a big legacy attached to him post-mortem.
Right. Some of which is we modern historians agree with, and some of which they don't. So let's get into that.